we can call it as 4 stages of marketing concept, in which toward the left is the more traditional approach to marketing, and toward the right is the more modern and science-based practice of marketing, which we called marketing concept. And one way to remember is that in our society, all of these are still relevant, although later on we can see that marketing concept is the progress that we need to, I mean, in terms of using our study in here to be able to apply. First of all, the production concept is the stage or the situation in which the marketer thinks, or the idea of marketing is based on the purely rational consideration, in which a product or service will be able to will succeed in the market if it is cheap, if it is if it can be produced if efficiently, if can be distributed with the lowest cost, so that in the end the low price will be the competitive advantage. So the purchase of the consumer is purely based on the price. So this is what is called as production concept. When a company, or it can be a startup, when a startup start thinking of the strategy to make their business a success only based on the consideration of the making the price low, that's what they still use the production concept. It used to be applied by the businesses years ago, I mean in the past, or in the most traditional market. When the market realized that in certain situation, consumer are willing to purchase more expensive things, or when there are when the consumer having the ideas that sometime and mostly the higher price means also the better or the higher quality, then the idea of business is based on producing the quality and producing the best performance and providing the most interesting, the most complete features of the product. So that's what is called as the product concept. So the focus is on the end result of the production, which is a product which is high quality, of highest performance level, with the most complete and functional features. That's what is called as production concept. Of course, with this all qualities, performance, and features come the price that the consumer has to pay. So in order to be able to sell this kind of products, then marketer need what is called as selling concept, in which the strategy is emphasized on persuasions toward the consumer, and the focus is on succeeding in making selling to the consumer. All strategies for convincing consumer that the product is of high quality with a rational price is what is called as selling concepts. These three first types of marketing concept, which is production, product, and selling, is focused on the product itself, understanding the product itself. The strategy is focused on the business and the product itself, and not from the end of the process, which is the consumer. And that's the essence of the marketing concept, because the business start not from what they are able to produce, at which cost, producing what type of products, what quality of product, and through which way to convince the consumer. But the start of the process is from the understanding the consumer. What do they want? What do they need? What make them happy? What make them proud of themselves, and so on. And after understanding the consumer, then the marketer go on to thinking about design. What kind of product, what features will fit to what the consumer need, and that was what is called as marketing concept. But what we have to be aware of this is that what the consumer needs and what the consumer wants actually is not the objective state of things. I mean, it is not something which is there among the consumer, but the needs and the want itself can be created by the marketer. The aspirations, the ideals of the consumer is something which is fed upon by the marketer. So this is what make it interesting, understanding the consumer, not only the consumer as who they are, but consumer as who they can be, or consumer who can be made to be. That's all about understanding the consumer behavior. Once we understand the consumer in this sense, then the marketer can create strategies of producing the goods and delivering through the channels of distributions to be able to reach all of these segments of consumer. That's what is called as marketing concept. So again, to summarize, marketing concept is based on understanding of the consumer, whereas the other production and product especially is based on understanding of the efficient production strategies. So these are the difference between all of these marketing concept.
Great, Pak Rahmat. That's very thorough. And it's also really interesting how you say that needs and wants are not as the consumer's state now, but it's also about what they might be and what we can make them be by designing things that might make them think they actually wanted or needed instead of actually accommodating what they actually need. So yeah, that's actually really interesting.
Exactly. In a way, actually, understanding the consumer behavior can be quite scary to us, because when we are learning more and more of consumer behavior, then we come to a stage when we realize that we as a consumer in many situations are as not autonomous, as independent, as in quote dignified as we think of ourselves. Many of our behavior are under the influence, but we realize it or not, of somebody else out there, who are especially the marketer. Thinks of your younger brother or sister or nieces and so on, which still young enough, like 5 or 6 years old, when they, sorry to mention product and brand, when they eat about their Oreo, for example. Why should they do it like being diputar, dijilat, dijulupin? Why should they do that? It's nothing essential, but it becomes a point of selling from the marketer, and that's something, it become like ritual, which then uh, unintentionally and beyond the control of the young consumer, they, if they don't do that, they feel it's not right for themselves, which is that means it's not purely what best in for what of their best interest is it, because that's created, the idea created by the marketer. So that's to think about how marketing concept, which is based on the knowledge of consumer behavior and consumer psychology, may actually influence a lot of part of our life, for good or for
For bad,
worse.
for
Yeah.
worse. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, moving on to the next concept. This is actually something that we're going to discuss more on next week. So when we are actually implementing the marketing concept, as Pak Rahmat already mentioned, you first have to do a research on the consumers. What do they like? What do they not like? And we'll generally study their behavior and study what they can be, as Rahmat mentioned earlier. After that, you think about the segments of the customers there are. For instance, in an airplane, when you buy a airplane ticket, for instance, some people think of buying the cheapest airline ticket, and some people want to have room, they want to have a comfortable space, they want to have prime service, and so on. So those are called segmentations of the consumers. There are different types of consumers for different types of products and services. So after you do research and think about the segments of the product or the service that you're going to do, you target one of them. For instance, if you're going to create an airline that only targets people who want to fly cheap. So you create CityLink, sorry to mention a brand, CityLink or AirAsia. And then you think about the positioning of that brand, how to create distinction between one brand and another brand. So that's generally what segmentation, targeting, and positioning is. You don't have to think a lot about that right now because we're going to dive into that a whole lot next week. There's going to be one whole session just to talk about the STPs that we mentioned here. But so that you get an idea, that's kind of what it is. But Ahmad, do you have anything else to add on?
Very clear, I think, but I'd just like to give some highlights on the first part, which is the consumer research. The box in the upper part, basic and applied studies. So that's the two types of the research that we are doing, basic and applied, as well as applying positivistic or the quantitative, put survey experimental studies, and interpretive, the qualitative studies. So you can see from this small box that consumer behavior is based on the essentially all type of our research that we are doing and that you are studying throughout your study at this Faculty of Psychology. You learn basic research. Later on, when you go into the professions, for example, consultant in consumer behavior and marketing research, for example, or you are involved in marketing department of a company, then you do the applied research. For the research, you apply all types of methodology that you learned in your study here. The quantitative, positivistic, put the survey methodology as well the experimental methodology, and all type of interpretive research, the qualitative research. There are consumer behavior at the applied setting who conducts phenomenological studies, ethnographical studies, grounded research studies in order to get better and deeper understanding of the consumer, of how the consumer responds to the product being introduced to the market. So that's what make knowledge of psychology is so very relevant, and learning all aspect from your study in here, the research methodology can be very useful for you, but when you go into the applied setting in marketing, as well as you go into the academic, of course, setting like what I and Mbak Safira do at this faculty.